If you've listened to Brewlosophy at all, you know how much we love Imperial Yeast. The company was founded on the ideal that if you're going to do something, do it right. From their Imperial Pitch-Right pouches, packing a whopping 200 billion cells of healthy and viable yeast in each pouch, to their commitment to commercial customers guaranteeing 10 of their most popular strains are in stock for orders up to 20 liters, or the shipping is free, Imperial Yeast does it right. No more worrying about whether you need to make a starter or propagate your yeast prior to pitching. Imperial Yeast makes it easy for the home brewer and commercial brewer to obtain direct pitches at proper rates when you need it. To place a commercial order or to get more information about everything that Imperial Yeast has to offer, head on over to imperialyeast.com. Welcome to the Brew Lab. One of the more interesting challenges facing brewers today is monitoring and understanding how to brew with changing raw materials. As the world gets hotter, growers face new challenges like intense heat, water shortages, and even the threat of wildfires and wildfire smoke. What are growers and brewers to do in the face of changing world climate? I'm your host, Cade Job. In episode 140, I led with the same opening when I talked with Dr. Harmony Bettenhausen and Dr. Campbell Morrissey about the changes of climate change concerning the backbone ingredient of beer, that is barley. It only makes sense to do another episode on the spice of beer, hops. And to help me understand how climate change is impacting hops and hop growers, I'm speaking with Jeff Dailey of John I Haas and Ryan Christian of Yakima Chief Ranches. These two are representatives of two of the major players in the hop market with deep insights into how hops are impacted by global warming. Jeff, of course, you know from several discussions we've had about hop sensory. So from him, I want to know how hop quality is changing and what companies like John I Haas are doing to preempt those changes. And Ryan is the VP of research of the breeding efforts of the Yakima Chief companies. So obviously we'll talk about traditional breeding and how those tools are being used to combat climate change. And much like the episode with Harmony and Campbell, all is not lost with hops. The industry is rising to meet the challenges of global warming, and there is hope, which is where we'll finish the show. If you haven't yet signed up to become a patron, please consider doing so. By becoming a patron of Brewlosophy, you get access to awesome rewards like Brewlosophy contributor recipes that we've never published, new discounts each month to YakimaValleyHops.com, and for $3 a month, access to a monthly live Q&A session with a special guest from the brewing industry. This week's guest is Dana Garvis of Oregon Brew Labs. If you've got questions about beer and brewing science and you want to ask her about these, you have to sign up this week. So please head over to patreon.com/Brewlosophy to find all the information you need to get access to this awesome resource. I want to say another big thank you to everyone who's left a rating or review of the show. If you haven't yet left a rating or review, I'd love for you to do so. Every review helps us improve the show. I read them all, and I love hearing from you. If you haven't yet taken the time, please take a moment to help us out. Feedback is brought to you by the dedicated crew at Haas and the Hop Breeding Company, who bred Sabro from a Neo-Mexicanus subspecies growing wild in the mountains of Mexico. Think you know Sabro? Think again. This monster of a hop is efficient when it comes to delivering big flavor. Use less green to save more green, if you know what I mean. And if you like pina coladas and getting caught in the rain, try it out in the whirlpool. It's full of aroma and chemical compounds that last from the hot side to the final glass, even if you dry hop on top of it. Sabro is known for its incredible blend of coconut, tropical, and stone fruits with a pronounced cream character with flavors of vanilla, cedar, dill, and even mint. Can't decide where to use it? No sweat. Sabro is available in all Haas hop formats to meet your brewing needs, from highly consistent Lupamax pellets to efficient Incognito and traditional T90 pellets. Learn more about this awesome variety as well as the other innovative products Haas has to offer at johnihaas.com. That's John, the letter I, Haas.com. Listener Eric Sheppybrew wrote in. He says, "Hey Cade, love the show. I know it's been a while since episode 97, reusing spent hops in the brew kettle with Dean Hauser, and number 98, applying the science of that episode. However, when I dry hop, I use either one of those stainless steel hop sleeves or a hop bag. I've always been a little bummed out when I pull those out. They smell like there's still quite a bit of hoppiness in there, and I always feel like it's a waste to just throw that away. When I listened to the Reusing Spent Hops podcast, I knew I wanted to give that a try. It took me a while, but I currently have a Black Saison on tap, in which I used spent hops for bittering. Last time I brewed a hazy IPA, I saved the sleeve of dry hops, a total of 2.25 ounces of Eclipse, Talus, and Mosaic, put them in a plastic bag, and kept them in the freezer. When I plugged the bittering addition into Beersmith, I assumed 60% of the average alpha acids of the three hops. 60% is what stuck into my head as the suggestion from the podcast, but I didn't go back and listen, so I might be misremembering. Nope, you're right, 60% sounds about right. For the bittering amount I wanted from this addition, the combination was actually added at 20 minutes left in the boil, so not only did I get bittering, but a fair amount of hop flavor. The resulting beer is fantastic. The fruity, citrus, tropical spent hops add just enough of an American hop profile to give the Saison a really unique flavor. It's not really a classic Saison, but I really love the beer. I'm not a great judge of bitterness, but I think it tasted pretty close to what I expected based on the taking 60% of the alpha acids. So if there's anyone out there wondering if they should try saving their homebrew hops to add in future beer, my experience says go for it. I'm probably too lazy to always do it, but I will try it again at some time. And he actually linked both of his recipes. So if you're interested in those, I'd be happy to share those with you. Eric, thanks for sharing your experience. That's totally awesome. And also really cool that you're able to harvest the hops by using a stainless steel sleeve or a hop bag. I mean, that's a really amazing option for home brewers that's not available to craft brewers. It's kind of difficult for craft brewers to get hops out of the bottom of the fermenter amongst all the gunk and everything else that's in there. But if you're fermenting in a keg or you're fermenting in a fermenter where you've used those stainless steel sleeves or hop bags, this is a great solution. And I'm glad to hear that adding it at 20 minutes in the boil still provided some aroma too. I mean, that's something that would be interesting to explore in more detail. All right, well, thank you, Eric, for writing in. I'm going to take a short break, and then I'll be back with Jeff Dailey and Ryan Christian talking about how climate change is impacting hops. The dry yeast revolution is here, and Cellar Science is leading the charge. Cellar Science has expanded the world of dry yeast far beyond the drab landscape of yesteryear. With over 20 strains of beer and wine yeast now available, you can brew any style. Not to mention that their unique growth and harvesting process greatly increases lipid levels in yeast cell walls, removing the need to aerate your wort on the first pitch and allowing you to directly pitch without rehydration. Couple that with the other advantages of dry yeast, such as higher cell count and viability, and you can clearly see why commercial breweries across the U.S. are using dry yeast and choosing Cellar Science.
Fargo, the new virtual assistant from Wells Fargo, makes banking faster and easier. Like this.
Fargo, what's my checking account routing number?
And this.
Fargo, turn off my debit card.
And this.
Fargo, what did I spend on groceries last month?
And that's just the beginning. Do you, Fargo? You can in the Wells Fargo mobile app. Learn more at wellsfargo.com/getfargo.
Terms and conditions apply. Your mobile carrier's availability and message and data rates may apply. Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
Discover new opportunities together in a new Chevy. Meet up in an Equinox, winner of the J.D. Power Award for initial quality among compact SUVs. Lend a hand in the strong and capable Silverado. Or mix it up in a high-tech Trax with an available 11-inch diagonal touchscreen. Find family, friends, and fun in the Chevy that's right for you. Click to learn more. Chevrolet, together let's drive. For J.D. Power 2023 U.S. Initial Quality Study Award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
When Harmony Campbell and I talked about barley and climate change a few weeks ago, one of the big takeaways for me was that the barley industry isn't just sitting idle. They're actively taking steps to address the impact of climate change, and the hop industry is taking a similarly proactive approach. And so today, I'm speaking with representatives from two of the major players in the hop industry. That's Ryan Christian from Yakima Chief Ranches and Jeff Dailey from John I Haas. So Ryan, welcome to the Brew Lab.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. And Jeff, of course, welcome back to the Brew Lab, to our resident sensory scientist.
I'm back and I'm ready.
Oh, all right. That's good. He's ready. Does that mean you weren't ready for prior episodes? You were just kind of winging it?
How dare you accuse me of something so accurate? Come on now.
Nah, of course. So today's episode, y'all were actually part of a panel at the Washington State Brewers Guild alongside Ashley Hale, who's a colleague of yours, Ryan, who couldn't be with us today. But you guys were talking about climate change and hops. So this seems like kind of a big deal, right, Jeff?
Yeah, climate change is probably the most important topic on the planet, period. There's a lot of smaller, more acute issues that everyone deals in their own day-to-day lives, but this is the overarching issue that's going to affect everything, from the way we live our lives, the way we grow our hops, the way we enjoy our beers. So really excited to talk about this and what we're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, for sure. And then Ryan, of course, we'll talk a little bit more about what Yakima Chief Ranches is and how that's different from Yakima Chief Hops and the hop breeding company and all that stuff in a minute. But essentially, the nuts and bolts is you're actively immersed in hop breeding, right? Breeding new varieties of hops. So climate change is also a big issue for you too.
It is, yeah. Climate change is bad. It's bad for everybody, but it's especially bad for agriculture. We're dealing with organisms that can't move, that can't adapt, it can't get out of their environment. We have to manage their environment as best as possible to get the best quality and best yield, but we're really at the mercy of the weather and climate there.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Plants can't just walk around like humans do. They can't go get in the water somewhere or change their circumstances.
They're air conditioning out there in fields.
Yeah, exactly. They're hanging out in fields. They're actually tied to a vine, to a wire. So yeah, that's a really good way of thinking about that. So yeah, climate change is a big problem, and we talked about it last week or a couple of weeks ago with Harmony Bettenhausen and Campbell Morrissey about barley, and so of course this episode is going to focus on hops. Well, and by way of introduction, so Jeff, of course, is the sensory program manager at John I Haas, and Ryan is the VP of research at Yakima Chief Ranches. So Ryan, I thought it might be a good place to start is talk to me about the difference between Yakima Chief Ranches and Yakima Chief Hops and, the overlap there.
Yeah, it's all part of the same integrated supply chain, but we tackle two different parts of the hop supply chain. Yakima Chief Ranches is really more on the hop breeding and farm management or brand management side of things. So we really are handling everything up to delivery of the bales up to our processor, and that is YCH. YCH is handling everything post-harvest, whether that be processing, extraction, advanced products, marketing, distribution, etc. So yeah, that's to boil everything down to a short soundbite there. That's kind of the difference between the YCR, YCH.
Yeah, and you mentioned it's kind of like a part of the same integrated supply chain, and that's being like the grower-owned cooperative, right? So grower-owned cooperative kind of funding and working through all of this. Whereas Haas also has its own farms, right, Jeff? But it also has individual growers that it sort of contracts and licenses with. It distributes maybe on behalf of. I'm not sure. You know the language better than I do.
No, it's totally correct, Kay. We are fully vertically integrated. So we are farmers ourselves, but we are also merchants. We are also processors. We pelletize, we make extracts, we do R&D. It's all part of one contiguous company rather than with the chief world where there's kind of two separate farmer co-ops that work with each other. And like Ryan delineated between the farm focus, the breeding focus, and then moving that over to the commercial side as a separate co-op.
Yeah, and then of course there's this entity called the HBC, right? The Hop Breeding Company, which kind of marries all of this together into one really cool entity that can focus on hop breeding. So who wants to talk about HBC? Why don't, Jeff, let's let you talk about it, and then Ryan, I'll let you add your spin to it as well.
Sure. I will do my best here. HBC came out of a very specific need that Yakima and the Northwest was facing in the late 90s. At one point, powdery mildew was able to jump from a different set of plants. I believe it was melons or strawberries. And it was the first time that up in this high desert that had low pest pressure, hops started to get hit by this new pest and that had no defense for it. So HBC was formed out of a partnership between Yakima Chief Ranches, which at that point I believe was Select Botanical Group, in order to create this new program, this new company, this co-op HBC, that's focused on breeding the highest quality hops that are also agronomically sound from both a yield and a pest resistance perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and reading up on the HBC, Ryan, that's kind of one of the things I see as the driving goals of the HBC is, disease and pest resistance, right? Like Jeff just mentioned, it seems like it kind of spawned out of this, but that's not all that HBC does.
It's not, and that was one of the original goals of HBC was to be a driver for disease-resistant, high-yielding varieties that would drive value in the market. But it's diverged a little bit since those days. The craft brewing industry really hadn't taken off at the point that HBC was formed. So whereas we were looking originally at some of these more commodity-type hops, HBC really made a name for itself in the aroma space, particularly with the success of Citra and then Mosaic. So we really became a little bit more focused on the high aroma, flavor forward IPA kind of type of hops. But we've never really lost sight of those other more agronomic traits. So it's always been a driving focus of hop breeding.
Yeah, and then I mentioned I was going to let you talk about like the relationship between YCR, HPC, and stuff. Anything to add to what Jeff said?
Yeah. So YCR and John I Haas. The reason why that came together. The idea was to bring together all of the private breeding resources, the technical teams, the germplasm, the know-how, and the breeding experience from both companies at the time into a common program. So that's really where everything started, and we've maintained that same model to this day. We still maintain separate breeding teams, separate evaluation teams, different breeding objectives and different focuses, but all of our resources, all of our data, and all of our germplasm is still shared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in HPC, in the hop breeding company.
Correct.
Yeah, which is super cool, right? And I like the way that you describe that. It's sort of like leveraging and consolidating private breeding, and because that's ultimately what we're talking about today. I mean, we've had on the podcast before. I had Tom Nielsen from Sierra Nevada talking about the research from the Hop Research Council and the Hop Growers Hop Quality Group, and some of the public variety breeding that they're doing, and he's talked about importance there too. But of course, private breeding is a huge part of not only hop breeding itself, but how we meet the challenges of climate change. So I wanted to ask this question, and maybe you've already answered it, Ryan, but I wanted you to give me an example of an HPC success story.
Well, I mean, there's been quite a few different success stories. I mean, starting with Citra, but I think the one I'd like to highlight is Mosaic. Mosaic came about at a time that was just the right time and place for that variety. The craft industry was really starting to take off at that point. And there was a need for unique flavor hops. And, we just happened to time it correct at that time. And I know that our head breeder, Jason Peralt, speaks really fondly of the first beer that they ever brewed on the little farm brew system using Mosaic. And, we're just blown away by the aromatics of that variety and knew that they had something. So they, just happened to have the genetics at the right time for the market, and it just took off and never stopped.
Yeah, happened to have the right genetics at the time, and certainly having stood the test of time as well, right? Like still being one of the most popular varieties. I think Citra still is the most popular variety in the U.S. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's amazing. Citra is, and of course Mosaic, right? The number 2 most popular variety now as well. I mean, so that's pretty incredible. Those are 2 really amazing hits, right? From a success story from the HPC. And Jeff, I was going to ask you the same question, but I might prompt you a little bit here because I'm guessing if I asked you this question, you would want to talk about Sabro.
You know me too well. I want to start off though with just I think brewers out there talking about Citra Mosaic, there are Citra brewers and there are Mosaic brewers. And I want to do a quick poll here amongst the group of which are you? Are you a Citra person or a Mosaic person? So I think it comes down on political lines a little bit.
Oh, does like political lines? I'm definitely
not
Citra.
In that way.
Yeah, okay.
They're partisan.
Fair enough, partisan lines. Yeah, I'm a Citra brewer.
Ryan.
Yeah, lean more towards Citra as well.
Ooh, I'm the odd one out.
Oh, you're a Mosaic?
I'm a Mosaic person.
You like sweaty armpits?
Wow.
Just kidding.
No. Citra is so easy to use. It is, and that's one of the great benefits of it. It's why it was also the right place, the right time, new flavors. Mosaic, when someone's bold enough to use Mosaic and a 100% Mosaic IPA to do it really well, there's more attention a little bit. A little bit more intention about being able to make a successful 100% Mosaic IPA. So I just really appreciate the effort that goes into that. But Sabro, you want to talk about Sabro?
Well, hold on. I need to make a comment about that real quick too, because I love Mosaic too. I love both of those hops. I'm definitely more of a Citra person. I like Citra more, but that's changed recently for me. So in the last couple of years, I've switched from Mosaic to Citra, being the one I like a little bit more. Again, both great hops. Hops and Grain in Austin makes a beer that they call Mosaic IPA, and that IPA is fantastic. If you're ever in Austin and you get a chance to try that beer, you should absolutely absolutely go and try it. Mosaic IPA is great. And then also Community up in Dallas makes a Mosaic IPA beer as well too. So Mosaic makes a fantastic beer. I made the sweaty armpit comment because a lot of people talk about how Mosaic turns sweaty, but Citra also turns OG. So it's not like they have their own, or it can be OG. It's not necessarily always, but it can have a little bit of onion garlic character. So, but anyway, we're not talking about those hops today. This isn't but I mentioned Sabro, so let's talk about Sabro.
Yeah, Sabro is a good starting point when we're thinking about climate change or the efforts of the HBC. Sabro is a beast agronomically, which I know Ryan can speak to a lot better than I can. That's not my area of expertise. I dabble a little bit, but when I go in those fields, I see it growing. It does remind me of Mosaic, which is a super hardy plant as well. Mm-hmm. But the other side of what Sabro is, it's super consistent from a flavor perspective, as I've seen since I took over the hop quality program here in 2020. Resilient against smoke, which I'm sure we'll get into at some point, maybe just because of how potent a hop it is. But that's the other side of sustainability and fighting climate change from a brewer's perspective, is that Sabro was released into a market with maybe some expectation that it'd be just as easy to use as Citra. But it was so potent, so unique, that brewers went in the direction of, well, my experimental IPA is always 3 pounds per barrel, so let's do 3 pounds per barrel of Sabro. Now, the sustainability story here is, well, to get the impact of 3 pounds per barrel of Citra, you probably only need about a half pound per barrel, maybe a pound per barrel of Sabro. And that's less shipping, less storage, less BOD when dumping cones and things like that. Everyone in the brewing industry, from what we put in the ground and how we grow it to what they put in glasses, kegs, and bottles, all is contiguous with regard to how we can fight climate change and be more sustainable. And Sabro and hops like it play a definite role in that way.
That's a great comment, Jeff, and about like how brewers can use different kinds of hops, right, in sustainability, making sustainability choices. That's a great example. If you can use less of Sabro but still get that pungency that you're looking for, that impacts sustainability, it impacts climate change. But Jeff also mentioned, Ryan, some agronomic benefits of Sabro as well.
Yeah, I mean, Sabro checks off a lot of boxes for our growers. It's a fairly early hop, so it's not competing with some of the other major varieties out there, in particular the Citra and Mosaic, which both mature towards the middle of September. So there's just not as many picking resources, or just not as much throughput available at that time. So Sabro is really nice to have on the earlier end of that. And for an early hop, it's really quite well yielding and is consistent. So it's really a fairly sustainable hop to grow, just from a yield perspective alone, as well as fitting that or checking that box for our growers on the logistics side.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big deal for growers, right? I mean, I've done quite a bit of research into like hop maturity during my time with Tom Schellhammer at Oregon State, and picking windows are a big part of that, right? Like when you only have so many resources, really, it's so many kilns available that can dry hops, right? And so when you get an earlier variety like Sabro, one, you can pick it out of the ground earlier, which means you don't have to water it as often and take care of it and manage it and all that kind of stuff. So there's some climate savings there, but it also alleviates some of those stress points in the middle of the season, which is great. And so talking then more about climate change and hops specifically, Ryan, in your presentation to the Washington State Brewers Guild, you shared some pretty interesting information about climate predictions in Yakima now and years in the future. What can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so I have a slide in a lot of the presentations I give that's really just to illustrate the magnitude of difference from the climate of 2010, which is what my reference point is in that slide, into the 2080s. And that's using some climate data from CMIP 5, if anybody's familiar with that climate model, and then looking at an RCP 8.5 scenario, which is just business as usual. That's equivalent to about a 4 to 5 degrees C increase in temperatures by 2100. So it's pretty astounding to see that the shift of the growing region similarity is really what it's showing. Is it's a degree of difference from the current growing season overlaid on a map of the U.S. and over the world. And you can see that the similarity to 2010 conditions in Yakima shifts north and then shrinks as well. So you're really seeing that the climate of tomorrow is not going to look like the climate of today. And whether that's a good or a bad thing really depends on a lot of factors that I think we're going to get into in a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, and that's an interesting comment, right? It shifts north and it shrinks, right? And you know, that map is really cool because it shows like what, you know, it's kind of a relationship. Like if you put Yakima Valley it's in like, say, green is the color. And then, you know, like Florida, the other side of the United States is in a totally different relationship, right? It looks totally different. It's totally different climate. But you start to see, as he moves through the slides and you change those years, that green area just starts to like shift up, like you said, north and get smaller and smaller. And most of the United States starts to look like Florida or
Exactly.
dry, or like, you know, dry in Texas, which is really interesting to see. So, back to you, Jeff. We talk about climate change and the ways that that hops might be impacted. Why don't you start us off with a couple of things that are important to you in the way that climate change might be affecting hops that you're seeing from like the sensory brewing side?
So the number one thing that we have to be worried about is that unlike grapes, which for the wine industry can become more flavorful when they're stressed out and under irrigated and things like that, we do not have that knowledge when it comes to hops, and it's very unlikely that they'll have a similar stress response. There is the case that Paco, who works down in Cade Outdoors lab at the USDA, recently presented on some initial studies regarding a stress response when it comes to terpene content. And he found some differences when it came to his different watering practices, though those focused in on simple mean deviations on a quantitative level without taking into account the sensory aspect of it, where, you know, he saw a big difference in myrcene, but for our brewer friends, they know that myrcene really doesn't drive flavor, unlike thiols and terpenes and ketones and esters and all those great things. So our number one concern right now, from a sensor perspective, is that we don't know what's going to come. We have to spend a lot more resources right now planning out new trials, planning for a future that's very uncertain. And we don't have a lot of historical experience to fall back on, because just like with smoke, in 2020, which was a brand new experience that we weren't prepared for, the same thing is going to happen with significant swings in climate over the next couple of years. We had a little taste of it these last couple of years. In 2021, there was a heat dome in August that suppressed oil development and ripening for a couple of weeks. Last year, we had a late start to the growing season. This year, we had a freak June heat wave that's caused some split bloom in some varieties, which had an impact on quality for hops like Centennial. But it's little hits here and there. It's not endemic. It's not overarching major shifts in quality that we have an ability to draw inferences from.
Yeah, it's interesting. And talking with hop growers, like I used to remember, like I don't know if your parents ever had this, but my dad had this the Farmer's Almanac, and he would go and buy it every year, and it would be like, this is like, okay, if you're going to plant green beans or whatever in your yard, you need to do it at this time according to what the Farmer's Almanac would say. And it was like this printed book, and I was always amazed that you could go and somebody had like the forethought or knowledge that you could go and buy this book that had been printed, and you could read this book and it would tell you like, okay, I need to plant my green beans in the early part of April or whatever. And now I talk to hop growers, and they're like you just said, Jeff, like looking at just the last 4 years in breeding, like none of those were normal years. And in talking with a lot of hop growers, there certainly seems to be a sentiment from me, and I'll ask you this question, Ryan. There certainly seems to be a sentiment of like, what is normal anymore? Like, we don't know what normal is. It seems to be changing.
Yeah, I think, with climate change comes more extreme weather events, and it's just going to become more common over time. So a normal year is going to be rarer and rarer, I think. That being said, I think we can point to some other global partners and see what has been happening, particularly in unirrigated yards in Europe, for instance, where you have particularly sensitive varieties like Pearly, which 1 year may have an alpha content that drops by 50% or more because of a drought, because of heat stress. So if you aren't able to mitigate the effects of heat and drought with irrigation, you might be looking at that kind of dilution factor moving forward, as well as the yield drop. So like Jeff was saying, hops don't respond in the same way that grapes do. If you get a heat or drought event that can't be mitigated, you're getting dilution of those the critical brewing components, as well as the drop in yield. So all of the pain and none of the gain there from the grape analogy.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I'm sure this is stuff that you're looking at and thinking about as part of, YCR and your role as VP of Research, right? These are questions that you're going to be looking at and perusing over the next few years, right?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, one of the key parts of the Yakima Chief Ranches value model is providing brand consistency. So if there's going to be an impact of climate on the just the quality of our brands moving forward, we're actively investigating that for sure.
Yeah, and there was another thing I think that was mentioned in your presentation was these biotic stresses, right? This was arguably not arguably, it was one of the founding goals of the HBC was to breed pest and disease resistant varieties. That could be much more challenging in the future because, as I understand it, and I'll ask you this question, Ryan, but as I understand it, as we have drought and higher temperatures, pest and disease resistance goes down in the plants. They're more susceptible to these types of issues.
Certainly, and it really depends on the pest or the disease. So, for instance, mites love hot, dry, dusty conditions. As we trend towards hotter and drier late summer conditions, of course, we're going to get more mite problems. Mildews, on the other hand, tend to favor wetter, cooler conditions, aphids as well. So those may be actually positive trending in the future. That being said, last couple of years have had very cold and wet springs. So it's kind of a mixed bag. And, climate change is not just warming, it is also intermittent cooling. So it's just more extremes in both directions.
That's totally right. And that's super important, right? To mention on this show is it's not just that the world is getting, the world on average is getting hotter, but that hotter causes fluctuations in weather, right? It causes these super highs and super lows, which is something that especially hops aren't really good at dealing with, right? Hops aren't good at those super high temperatures. They're a pretty heat intolerant plant, which is one of the reasons why it grows in that narrow band along is it the 47th parallel? I always forget. I feel like I should know that.
Yeah, it's like 37 to 50 approximately, depending on the region. Yep.
There you go. Something like that. But it was so perfect. And then, one of the things that Ryan Gregory's also been looking at, which is he's the agronomist at Hopsteiner, was looking at measuring this CO2 equivalent emissions from hops. And in his first round of research, when he came out and talked to the podcast about it, he was looking at he noticed that the CO2, hops that are having higher CO2 equivalent emissions are the ones that are less pest and disease resistant because you've got to use all these, a lot more pesticides and fertilizers and that sort of stuff to grow those hops. And so one of his comments, and I would ask, Jeff maybe about this, is one of his comments was like, maybe we need to be looking at shifting varieties around and growing more of those varieties that are more pest and disease resistant, or, finding varieties that smell, taste the same, but have better agronomic traits.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. That is one of the new goals of HBC is obviously we talked about pest resistance and being agronomically sound, but moving in the direction of providing insurance policies for brewers who have specific flavor targets, but are both mindful about sustainability, about those CO2 equivalents of delicate hops that aren't really resilient to climate change. But also have their own brand requirements. They need the same sort of flavors. And so coming up with new varieties that can supplement or even replace varieties like Centennial per se is a high priority because same or less inputs, more outputs is the number one way that we at the growing level, I think, can move forward. There's not going to be any other silver bullet. We are forced to grow in the area that we are. We are forced to irrigate in a similar fashion as we always have, despite, advents moving from flood irrigation to drip and things like that. That's been very effective. All else we can do is make smart crosses and try and make better yielding plants, whether they're super unique, that go in the direction of Sabra that has its own story, or can mimic, supplement, replace varieties like Centennial. That's going to be the future as far as I can tell.
Yeah, that's good, and that's a great segue into talking about the role of breeders. But before we do that, I gotta talk about your other great friend. It's also starts with an S. It's not Sabro, but it's your great friend Smoke. Which I know you want to talk about a lot on this episode, and you want to spend the rest of this time talking about Smoke. But I'm going to limit you to just a few seconds to talk about Smoke's impact on hops.
I will do my best. No, it's great timing because, not to be doom and gloom, for the first time in the institution's history, NOAA changed its climate prediction in the middle of the year from a La Nina year to an El Nino year. And so we are looking at a very different growing condition that is actually separated between our two great growing regions, Cade, you down on the Willamette and us here in Yakima, as evidenced the last couple of weeks where your snowpack was at 30-ish% of average, and now it's at 110 because of one storm that dumped 70 feet of snow up in the high Cascades.
Exactly. Yep, that's right.
Whereas we've had nothing but rain, which does not fill the reservoirs in quite the same way. So what this might mean for years like this, and it might be intermittent, every couple of years, decent chance of this being a smoke event sort of year. It all depends on when the fires happen, but that is a climate reality that fires will happen. We have some evidence to show that early fires in the June timeframe, before plants have had a chance to I'm forgetting, inflorescence, or what Ryan's going to correct the word, it's something like that. When they start to make flowers, before they start to ripen, before they need the UV of clear, bright, hot skies to really ripen and produce the impactful aroma compounds, if the smoke happens earlier in the season, we're less likely to see such a significant impact on quality. However, if 2020 or 21 happen where the smoke just piles in August at the most critical time point, then we'll deal with some of those same issues that you might see with irrigation being cut off. The plants are being stressed beyond their typical ability to manifest positive aromas. They lose access to UV light. They start to take on both organic compounds, volatile phenols, but also inorganics. I know that you're looking into some of that, Cade, with, or there are studies out there looking into what happens when you burn wood versus homes. Oh, you start to get some really nasty stuff like benzene that might be depositing itself on hops. Not to scare any of the listeners, but it's a real issue when we have diverse living situations, diverse biomes in the Northwest. All of these things will contribute to, hopefully won't contribute. Hopefully everything will be timed just lucky enough that we won't have to deal with another smoke year, because smoke breaks the Jeff, and Jeff likes having a job.
Yeah, for sure. I know. I mean, it seems like you've just been immersed in smoke for the last several years, and of course, I keep pulling you back into it. But you mentioned 2020 and 2021 as big smoke event years, but let's not forget also that 2022 up in Idaho was a big smoke year, right? I mean, up in northern Idaho, where Anheuser-Busch has their big growing facility, there was a fire that was literally across the street from the hop farm. And that was a big deal. And this is certainly something that we're going to be looking into in the future, and something that's going to play a role as we address climate change. And again, not to be all doom and gloom, but that is kind of how I set up the show, right? Let's talk about the challenges in the first half, and then in the second half, let's talk about all the things that we can do to meet these challenges. And Ryan, one of the big things we can do is talk to breeders, right? And work on solving some of these issues with breeding. So before we take our break, why don't you give me like a top level role of breeders in dealing with and addressing climate change issues with hops?
I mean, the role of breeding in the first place is to provide value throughout the value chain. So that is both to the growers as well as to the processors, to the brewers, and to the end consumers. As long as you're able to deliver value in one or more of those parts of the chain, the breeder has done their job. So I think going back to your what you're talking about with the CO2 equivalent per for individual hops, and talking more about the sustainability of hops rather than some of the flavor components or things like that. There's two major drivers of that. One is yield, and that's always a key driver of breeding across all crops. The more you yield per unit land, it's roughly the same inputs. You're using less land, less water to produce the same amount of hops, same amount of labor. And then the second component of that is, as you mentioned earlier, the pests and diseases. And it's not just the sprays themselves. I mean, they have an environmental impact. They disrupt the microbiota. They destroy your predator populations. But what you have to remember is that there are tractors that are driving over that land over and over and over, burning diesel, and that's really where you get huge increases in the CO2 equivalent per kilogram of hops. So there are certain things you can do on the management side of things, whether that is planting a disease-free stock, which can bump your yields, managing cover crops correctly, managing beneficial insects, that can help with those and mitigate some of those factors. But really, a long-term view of things, you need to have new genetics that are able to address that more consistently. The fact of the matter is a variety like Centennial is never going to yield as much as a higher yielding variety, a more modern variety. And unless we have a modern answer to that, we're really looking at a fairly high impact crop.
Yeah. I love that example, right, of the Centennial. Everybody loves using Centennial. It's still a very popular hop out there. But yeah, it's a challenge to grow. And so I like that idea of thinking about bringing up a modern Centennial. And that's a good segue. And again, breeding is an option out there for answering climate change issues. And like I said on that episode with Harmony and Campbell about barley, the world isn't coming to an end yet. We got a lot of time left before we're out of here. Beer's been around for 3,000 years, and we want it to be around for another 3,000 years. So, like we did with the barley episode, we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back on the things that we can do to address hops and climate change.
One of the biggest improvements to my brewing practices was the upgrade to stainless steel, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which holds 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to reduce the chances of a messy blow-off, and it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brew systems out there, and their prices are remarkably affordable. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, you've got to check out deltabrewingsystems.com. We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brewlosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
Hello, saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.
The regular season is heating up. New stars are emerging, and that means more opportunities to win up to 25 times your cash on Prize Picks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projection on a wide variety of stats, and place your entry. It's that easy. Let it fly to turn $10 into $250 with just a few taps. Easy gameplay, quick withdrawals, and injury insurance on your picks are what make Prize Picks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Watch your favorite players and get paid doing it this basketball season. See your entries make progress during the game or make new entries for the second half and the fourth quarter. 3-pointers, assists, rebounds, and everything in between are yours for the taking. Join the Prize Picks community of more than 7 million players who have already signed up. Right now, Prize Picks will match your first deposit of up to $100. Just download the Prize Picks app and use code GET100. That's code GET100 on Prize Picks for a first deposit match of up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
The barley breeder Pat Hayes told me the phrase, "No barley, no beer." Is it the same for hops? Or maybe a better way to ask that question is, Jeff, are we going to run out of hops anytime soon?
I don't think we're going to run out of hops anytime soon. I will say as a former regulatory type person, without hops, there is no beer because you legally can't call it beer without hops. That is one of those nice things. We got into the CFR around the time that we ended prohibition. It's super sweet for us.
I love the response there to the barley breeder, right? It's like, yeah, sorry, barley breeder, but hops are in this too.
Yeah, I mean, but the main thing is there's an ethos in beer. That hops are important, that hops play a role, whether it's macro lagers, whether it's IPAs, whether it's Dunkel Weissens or anything in between. Hops play a significant role in the character, in the culture of what makes beer great. And I know John I Haas, Barthos Global, and I'm sure it's true for Yakima Chief and its affiliates, Hopsteiner, every program in between, we are invested in the future of hops. We will find a way to grow hops. We will find new places to grow hops because there is a need, because hops are important, because beer is important at a sociological, anthropological level, at a cultural level, at an economic level. Beer will exist forever, and we will find a way to get there.
Yeah. I love it. That's what an amazing message. Beer will last forever. I was going to, you know how I always ask you that thing at the end of the show where I say, tell me one thing that you want brewers to take away. I think that's the thing I want brewers to take away from this episode is we'll find a way to make beer. Now, one thing that we did forget to talk about in the last segment was, of course, the impact of water and how that's changing and how, we're looking at, currently floods right now in California, but also in years past, massive droughts around the U.S. and parts of the world. Ryan, what about water and hops?
Well, I think that's, it's really relevant to this kind of hope for the future section, where we have an advantage in having irrigation, that the major stresses from climate change, from drought and water stress in the late summer, as long as you have sufficient irrigation water, the plants can really manage things. And we have to talk about this method of photosynthesis that hops use called C3. C3 is just taking carbon out of the air. There's no barrier, there's no concentration mechanism. And a kind of clunky enzyme called rubisco is taking that carbon, fixing it into a stable form. So C3 having no concentration mechanism, if it starts getting to the point where the plant needs to start shutting down and it doesn't have enough water, that clunky enzyme will start fixing oxygen instead through this process called photorespiration. And so it's kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of scenario. So the hotter it gets, the drier it gets, the worse that enzyme works. So I guess to sum that all up, if you have enough water, you can mitigate that. But the water availability, we alluded to earlier, that is dependent on snowpack up in the Cascades. Of course, Yakima is a desert, gets less than 10 inches of rain a year. Our water comes from 100 miles away. But the form that water comes in, the timing, as well as the timing of the snow melt, really impacts how well we're going to grow hops in the future. So if we get sufficient snow, if it melts off at the right time and our reservoirs are full, we're okay in the short term and the medium term. Really more the long term that we're a little bit more worried about, as well as these kind of more extreme years where drought emergencies are declared.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. You're right. Like, it's a double-edged sword, right? That hops can be irrigated and their infrastructure for irrigation is already set up. I mean, Campbell mentioned on the barley episode that a lot of barley is grown in rangeland, right? And so that's not irrigated. So if there's a drought or something in those areas, that barley is in trouble. But the benefit, so it is kind of a benefit that if we have irrigation, we're able to irrigate hops, we can mitigate some of those drought and temperature issues, like Ryan is saying. Of course, that assumes, like Ryan said, the other side of that sword is that the water is available and that you can get it there, and that you're not experiencing drought conditions and things like that. So there is a little bit of hope for the future in the hops and in hops, and I think that one of the big reasons and big parts of this is the role of private breeding. And so I wanted to ask you guys this question, and I think Ryan, I'll start with you here. Is what's the role of private breeding in the industry with respect to climate change?
Well, this comes back to providing value for the growers, and then ultimately throughout the value chain to the end consumer as we're trying to pass that value down. hop breeding is not just breeding for the brewing world of today. It's trying to brew for tomorrow, breed for tomorrow's brews, to put that a little bit different way. And we're trying to explore many different angles, many different sources of germplasm to bring in novel traits, whether that is heat and drought tolerance or just completely new flavor genetics that the world of today doesn't know it wants, but the world of tomorrow might. So it's really incumbent on the breeder to explore all of those different avenues and try to predict what the world of tomorrow is going to need. And of course, we hear it constantly that climate change is going to change our growing conditions, and obviously it's a major objective for our breeders.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Like we mentioned earlier, like that HBC was formed to address, disease and pest control, and of course now is embracing the climate change issues. But Jeff, some of the varieties that have come out of HBC are Citra, Mosaic, Equinox, Laurel, Sabro, Talus. All of those incredibly potent, hoppy, aromatic hops that we love to brew with now, right? Whenever the breeders started this back in 2003, they weren't thinking about brewing Sabro or Talus, but now we've got really incredible varieties that we can brew with and that also are agronomically viable.
Yeah, it's 100% true. And to kind of play around with this a little bit, I think one of the roles of a private breeding company like Haas, it's going to sound wrong, it's a little bit like the CIA. Our greatest successes are the things that you don't hear about. The way that we've created incredibly potent hops, incredibly amazing, unique hops that we have killed off because they aren't agronomically sound. That we are rapidly moving on a yearly basis to come up with that balance of sustainability and amazing flavor, and not letting something that grows 400 pounds per acre out into the wild, then it takes up 10,000 acres. That we are actively screening that out, and that we are using our knowledge actively, and Ryan knows this better than me, actively collaborating with the USDA breeding program through ours. We are all diligent collaborators and funders of the HRC. We're members of the Hewlett Institute in Germany. It is an international congress of hop growers and breeders, and the role, as I see it, for private is just, like in most cases, to move a little bit faster, to invest a little bit more in R&D, and then bring that information, bring those learnings back to the public so that everyone benefits.
Yeah. And I mean, I was going to say, I know neither of you guys would probably go down this path, but it's important for me as a consumer and also somebody that's working in the public space, the resources of the HBC, right? You've pooled your resources between Haas and Yakima Chief, and you've created this organization that has funds and can study and do these things, right? I mean, it's supported by industry, whereas the USDA is reliant on federal funding and grants and all that stuff. Essentially grant funding to fund the public breeding efforts like Hop Research Council, Hop Quality Group, USDA, all that sort of stuff. Private breeding comes to the table with resources, and that's where you get some of these cool varieties like Citra, Mosaic, Laurel, Sabro, Talus, that have flavor and aroma impact, but also agronomic impact as well. Now, Ryan, I wanted to talk about breeding, and especially what you're doing there at Yakima Chief Ranches and of course HBC. But I've always, and this may be the wrong way to think about it, but at least I've always thought about traditional breeding kind of being like Forrest Gump's box of chocolates. Like, it's a box of chocolates, but you don't really know what you're going to get whenever you open it. But is that true? Like, what's the traditional hop breeding process like?
That's an interesting way to put it. I think if that was true, we wouldn't need breeders.
Right? Maybe.
So there's certainly an art and a science to hop breeding that we definitely need a very well-informed breeder and breeding team that can help drive the direction of things and be able to predict what that box of chocolates might contain.
Yeah, right. Right.
So yeah, it is a very intentional process. We have very specific objectives and strategies that go into the crosses that we make. But what it looks like kind of on the holistic level is you can think about it like a funnel that we're trying to sieve out the, thousands, tens of thousands, whatever it is, seedlings that we get in a given year down to the couple that might have commercial potential. So every selection cycle, and we have a couple of different strategies for doing so, but we're trying to call out a huge percentage of the ones that are not clear winners, are the ones that don't fit our breeding objectives. because we're both simultaneously trying to find those commercial winners as well as advance our populations and just increase our genetic potential, whether it is a commercially viable brand or not. If it still advances that population, it's still worthwhile germplasm. So it may fit the breeder's objectives in that case, if not the commercial objectives. So yeah, on the holistic level, we're just trying to take those very large number of hops down to a small number with an increasingly stringent set of parameters and hypotheses that are trying to winnow out with each cycle.
Right. And the things that you're talking about are like meeting like yield amounts, right? Or like disease, pest resistance, right? I mean, if you breed a hop that's very susceptible to, for example, downy mildew, that's not going to make it through, right? Because unless it's got some other really amazing qualities, but not to just like focus on one thing. But how long does this whole funneling process take? Like if you're to saying like starting from like the first, cross down to talus, like a released variety that's out there. How long does that take?
Traditionally, we talk about it on a roughly 10 to 12 year cycle. Now, there are some strategies that we can apply to reduce that. There's fast track, there's marker assisted selection. There's these more innovative technical solutions to try to find something earlier in the process and move it on quicker.
Now, I want to interrupt you right there and ask about some of those a little bit in a little bit more detail, because as I think back to the prior segment, you were talking about climate change and how the Yakima Valley might change from 2010 all the way to 2080, right? If we're talking about a 10 to 12 year time frame for producing new varieties, we're talking about, really only getting, what would that be, 7 or 8 bites at the apple before we're essentially today to breed today, you're having to plan for 10 to 12 years from now. So you're having to look at those climate impacts 10 to 12 years from now and decide whether the crosses that you have today are meeting conditions that are going to exist in 10 or 12 years, which that seems incredibly difficult. But like you just mentioned, and this was part of your talk at WBC, there are some modern tools that might be able to shorten this breeding process. And that is, in my opinion, a real hope for the future in terms of hop breeding, because we might be able to be a little bit more nimble in some of these things. Is that right?
Absolutely. And yeah, marker assisted selection in particular is using genetic information, genetic correlations to traits of interest, and searching for those within your seedling populations and being able to select for the individuals that fit the criteria that you define. As far as breeding for the world tomorrow, it comes down to one, having a really robust selection pipeline, and keeping the germplasm that may not fit today, but may fit the world of tomorrow. So as Jeff was talking about, the germplasm resources we've developed over time, even if we're not actively pursuing it as a commercial release, there's still something that's we're just kind of sitting on the back burner. It may be useful in the future. Yeah, so that's kind of, I guess, yeah.
Like a good summary of a modern tool. And I mean, this is actually one of the things I talked about with Chris Willig several weeks back. He's working with Steve Strauss here at Oregon State and doing some interesting plant breeding work, is the way that we can use genetic engineering. We can use genetic engineering as what he called a knowledge gaining tool. And then there's also, of course, the changing the genome of the plant and seeing what happens, right? But that marker assisted selection is that front part, right? It's like someone somewhere is doing the research, deciding that, hey, this gene codes for, I don't know, I'm just going to make something up, virus resistance or downy mildew resistance. And so as a breeder, you can use that, look for that gene in your seedlings and plant stock and say, okay, we're going to take only the ones that have this gene in it. And that allows you to essentially not have to grow up the plant and plant it, expose it to downy mildew and see if it's susceptible, right? You've got this, and that sort of cuts out that part of the process.
Yeah, and that would be a really simple example, I think, of something you could potentially screen for at the seedling level. But you take something like yield that takes 5+ years to get a good sense of. If you can develop a good marker for that, or heat tolerance, drought tolerance that is a little bit harder to assess, that's really where I think the marker assisted selection can come really handy in. The other part of that, that I kind of lost my train earlier, but is having more specific selection criteria. The fields that we evaluate in are intended to be kind of a survival of the fittest type scenario, where we're not trying to baby these crops at all. We're trying to stress them out in many conditions. We're letting pests and diseases kind of go naturally, especially in our seedling yard, we're really trying to encourage that and select against some of those really negative traits. But we have germplasm that it does quite well without irrigation, without a whole lot of management. So having those genetic resources available is, really valuable for trying to breed for the world of tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I totally understand that, and that actually kind of reminds me of what Jeff was talking about at the beginning of the show, or and it's like there are breeding opportunities for doing this. There are ways to breed for tomorrow, but there's also things that we can do now, right? Like Jeff, you were talking about Sabro and how Sabro you might be able to use less Sabro in place of Citra, and so that was kind of one of the questions I wanted to ask you, Jeff. Was like, what about like these alternative hop products, or not alternative hop products, but like hop products, like Incognito, Spectrum, Hopkick, that kind of stuff. Are there opportunities with current supply that we can, or current, I don't know, products, supply, technology, that kind of stuff that we can do on like a brewer flavor, sensory perspective, not just on breeding?
Yeah, absolutely. I will take one step back and say, for all the brewers out there, please feel free to continue to brew with 5 pounds per barrel of Citra. It does pay my mortgage. But for instance, Sabro can be blended in at a rate in order to reduce hops that are in the beer that cause loss, that cause increased BOD. But that also goes in the direction of what we're talking about here now with these advanced products. On the one hand, if you have advanced processing systems with CO2 recapture, producing a CO2 extract like Incognito, or CO2 extract down in Sunnyside at the Yakima Chief facility, which is well known for CO2 recapture, you're basically recovering 98 to 99% of the CO2 that's used in that process. So you aren't venting CO2 that's usually produced as part of either the cattle, livestock industry or petroleum industries as byproducts. At the same time, there's a reason that we moved from bales to pellets, and that's storage space and shelf life. Now, if you move from pellets to extracts, it's even more so. It's exponentially more so, where you need a smaller footprint for refrigerated warehousing for these extracts. And that is its own scale with regard to sustainability, reducing demand on the grid in order to run these refrigerated warehouses. This also applies to how big of a refrigerated truck do you need to ship these materials? How big of a footprint does a brewery need for cold storage to maintain the shelf life of these products, going from 6 pallets of pellets down to 1 pallet of 1 kilogram, 500 GMA grams of alpha acid cans of CO2 extracts. And it goes further and further and further. The more that we split the atom that are hops, the more that we find the most valuable components, the more that we can concentrate those down, the better we're doing when it comes to shrinking our footprint, shrinking our energy usage, and in the end, being a more sustainable industry.
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to ask that question, is because, like, I think about, you mentioned, like one of the reasons I asked this question is because I wanted to talk a little bit about yield and like saving that stuff, from a sustainability perspective. But you went a step further in something that I hadn't even considered, which is the amount of refrigerated storage that is needed for hops and pellets. And, even like you said, going from bales down to pellets, you still need refrigerated storage. And if you're looking at breweries, it's been several times mentioned on this podcast, one of the biggest costs and energy sources is refrigeration. For them. And of course, that's largely keeping beer cold, but it is also keeping your ingredients, right? Like keeping your malt in a cool, dark place where it's not, out, hot and humid. And also your hops, most people are storing their hops in a freezer or in a cooler. So that's also refrigerated space that's out there. And one other question that also just popped into my mind while you were talking about that, Jeff, was I mean, I think your CEO just announced, Tom Davies just announced like a couple of weeks ago that the U.S. is going to really cut back on hop production this year, of course, because of some, supply issues. But what about all these old crops that are going to be sitting in freezers and stuff? I mean, we're surely not just going to toss all those out, right?
We are not. How we might be able to use them is still debatable. We are working on some studies with regard to the viability of old crop year pellets and their brewing value. What we do know when it comes to a certain brewing value is that these older crop years are just as capable of being converted into CO2 extracts as fresh hops. So there's always the opportunity there for those hops to be used and put out into the market. And that, again, reduces the footprint of the refrigeration that's being used for these older crops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But more to come regarding straight usage of T90s from, say, 2017, 2019, 2020, 2021. I know there's a study at OSU that's starting to ramp up that's in that direction that I'm happy that we're going to be a part of. And we have our own internal research that's moving that direction.
Yeah, that's certainly going to be something that's exciting. Of course, the whole point of discussing these things, like the advanced products, the advanced CO2 extracts, and using old hop years, is to make what you currently have go further, right? I mean, Ryan, you were talking about breeding and breeding for the future, and that's certainly looking ahead. But the second piece of that is making what we currently have go further, and as continuing to do that in the future as we meet those new challenges. So, Ryan, I wanted to ask: are there any new varieties that are on the way that have you excited, or that you might be excited about releasing in the future? And you don't have to mention them by name or number or anything like that. Just to talking in generalities about some things that have you excited about the future.
Absolutely. I think all of the varieties that are kind of in our experimental series right now are extremely exciting hops, and most of them are fitting within that kind of efficiency minded value proposition. You really saw the start of that, going back to Sabro, where the flavor efficiency, it was the primary driving value for Sabro. And we're seeing several of those, whether that's a 1019 or 586, that just has a really pungent, very unique, impactful brewing character that you can get away with using less hops to get more complexity and more flavor out of your beers. But on the other side of the equation, looking at more classic flavors, there are other varieties out there in our experimental series which are suitable substitutes for blending or complete replacements of older public varieties. Picking again on Centennial, I love Centennial as a variety, but it is just not a very good agronomic hop. We have some answers to that within our experimental series that can supplement or replace portions of those public hops. So these are hops that can yield a lot better on the same amount of ground, same amount of labor, same amount of water, mostly the same amount of inputs, and less pesticides, less fungicides that are needed to produce these hops. So from the perspective of where we're at right now in the brewing industry, where we really need to have greater efficiencies for all of the raw materials. Costs are increasing across the board for brewers as well as growers. So we need these higher yielding hops that can kind of help along and provide a little bit better value and decrease the cost of hopping at the brewery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and same question to you, Jeff. Any varieties that you're excited about, and talking about maybe some things that make you excited about them?
Yeah, I mean, 1019 and 586, the future is bright. We're going to crush it in terms of these flavors coming through. Those are the ones that are furthest along in terms of unique, potent flavors. But the second bucket, what we call the classics, this insurance policy I mentioned before that Ryan brought up, is something that I really, and this could very well be the last question, honestly, what's the takeaway? It's that climate change is very uncertain, but we know it's going to happen. We are developing these hops, and we know that there are certain varieties that are more susceptible to the stresses of climate change. These varieties have proven themselves, these ones that we're working on, they've proven themselves to be highly durable, highly resistant to the stresses we've thrown at them in the last 10 years. And a lot of credit goes to Ryan here. I'm cribbing on some data that he showed in the presentation, and it's varieties like 638, which in this last year, a challenging year for Centennial, doubled the yield of Centennial. And that variety, it's not 100% for Centennial. It's more like a Centennial Cryo or Lupomax, where it would be a partial replacement. So the point I'm getting to as a takeaway for brewers that for these varieties, look at your recipes. If you have a 2 pound per barrel Centennial beer, do 1 pound Centennial, half pound 638, and see how close it gets. Because as climate change happens, you're going to have to do partial replacements. You're going to have to plan for it. You're going to have to do replacement trials in a way that is already done at major breweries when it comes to these new malt varieties that come out. Because Lord knows, I wish we could come out with 6 new 2-row varieties every year and just have every farmer adopt them. Another great one with finally, it is upon us, the lager revolution that has been promised. We have an experimental called HBC 1134, and it had, compared to SOTS or some of its progenitors, its relations in Europe, its yield was 150% on a 5-year rolling average compared to those varieties. But the same thing applies. It's about working towards the future, having insurance policies that are more sustainable, and trialing these hops as they become available in order to suit the need of your consumers, which is the target flavor profile, which is the true to brand, and seeing how you can make that happen without being reliant on a single brand only, which locks you into a corner, both from, well, maybe your contract's just going to be shorted this year because of climate change, or because there's a quality issue because the plants were stressed out due to climate change. It's always good to have a backup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's always good to have a backup because, supply chain is what it is, right? Hops are grown every year, and they could be different every year. Or, well, let me back up. As a chemist, they are going to be different every year, right? That's just a part of it. The question is how far and how different. And like Jeff said, if you've got other options that are available to you, that's a great thing to be able to play around with, right? As you're looking at climate change and looking at even just regular decisions about hops. But then Ryan, so I think Jeff just answered his question about the one thing he wants brewers to take away from this is, think about other hop varieties here. But Ryan, I'll ask you this question as well. I always ask it at the end of the show. So if you want brewers to take away just one thing from today's episode, what would it be? What would it be?
Well, I think one thing I'd want people to take away is, kind of going back to the hops of today and how we can be more intentional about sustainability. Go and meet your growers. They have a lot of knowledge, and you'd be surprised at how they are tackling this head on. Protecting their soil, protecting water resources, and trying to manage the crop more sustainably. They put a lot of time and effort into the current varieties. And on the other side of things, be open-minded to some of these new varieties. Be willing to try them out, just as Jeff had said, and kind of keep an open mind. Play around with them, different recipes, different yeast, different utilization, different ways of utilizing them, to see if it works for your recipes and for your brands. Because we think that there's tremendous value here. There's certainly tremendous value at the farm level, and that we want to translate down to value to the breweries as well. So certainly be open-minded to try some of these varieties and see what they can do for you.
Yeah, and another big takeaway from this for me is there's a whole bunch of stakeholders here, right? You've got from growers that are interested in agronomic traits, but also want to make good hops that make good beer. You've got breeders that are looking to answer some of these climate change questions, but also make good hops and good beer. You've got the producers and distributors and pelletizers and people who are developing, like Jeff, who are developing advanced hop products, and checking and making sure that hops are of high quality as they're making it to the brew house. And then of course brewers who are trying to use great hops to make great beer. So everybody is sort of rowing in the same direction, and all working towards the goal, and everybody has something to add. And so that's another big takeaway that I would take here. I mean, if there's nothing more than like a collaboration, if there's, let me back up. If there's a good example, it's a collaboration between two competing hop companies to answer these questions for the future as one sort of, one unit through the HBC. And so Ryan and Jeff, I thank you both for your contributions to that and everything that you're doing for the future. Is there anything else, Jeff, that you wanted to add today that you didn't get to talk about?
Remember, kids, buy Sabro, especially Sabro Incognito. It's good for you. It's got all the vitamins and nutrients that plants crave. I mean, that brewers crave.
Yeah, I had to give an Idiocracy reference here. That's great. It's not sprayed with Brondo. Don't worry. Ryan, how about you? Is there anything else that you didn't get to talk about that you wanted to today?
Well, I don't think I could do any better than Jeff there. So yeah, just don't put Gatorade in your hops.
Awesome. Well, yeah, don't put Gatorade in your hops. Electrolytes aren't good for hops. Well, they are, but not that much. But all right, Ryan. Well, thank you so much for joining me in the Brew Lab.
Absolutely. It was a pleasure to be here.
And of course, Jeff, it's a pleasure to talk to you as always.
Yep. Pleasure's all yours, Cade. All yours.
All right. Well, next week, Jordan and I will be back applying the science of this episode. We'll see y'all then. The Brew Lab is a production of Brewlosophy, where they who drink beer think beer. Don't forget to visit brewlosophy.com to read about our weekly experiments and other brewing adventures, and listen to us talk about it on our other show, the Brewlosophy Podcast. Thanks to all of our sponsors and patrons that help make this show possible. If you'd like to receive a reward for helping us do what we do, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy to see how you can do just that. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in the Brew Lab with another guest next week. Until then, think beer.
Hello, Saver. Whether you're saving for that trip to the tropics or saving for an emergency, now is the time to take advantage of Wells Fargo's savings options. Wells Fargo offers savings accounts that can help you save towards your goals. So, what are you saving for? Visit a Wells Fargo branch or wellsfargo.com/save to open a savings account today.
Wells Fargo Bank, N.A., member FDIC.